and more bronze sculpture. Most of what I do is marine life and marine myth and fantasy and an actual
Hello and welcome to the Big Scuba podcast. Welcome to a little big chat edition. So this is about people coming on, talking to us about whatever they want to talk to us about, whether it's their new diver, where maybe they run a dive centre, maybe they've got a new line of wetsuits coming out, or maybe they've just completed a big project on marine science or something like that, and they want us to help spread that message. Doesn't matter, it's free, you know. They get 40 minutes to talk about them or whatever the subject is, and then we spread it. We put it on our YouTube channel, we put it on our Instagram, Facebook, social media, and then also all we ask is that they do the same across all their social media. And the more we share, the more it gets out there and the more it helps to keep things ticking over. The other thing I would say as well, don't forget to subscribe. There's more of these coming. We do several of these a month, and that's a blackbird that's now joining us. Everybody wants to be on the show. What can we say? There we go. So don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to ring the bell, and that way you'll keep up to date with what's coming on. See you soon. So Simon, welcome to the Big Scuba podcast. You know, this time, although it's only about 40 minutes, it's all about you and tell us about you and the things that you do. We've got your website. It's a great website. Some really great, you know, some really great stuff on there, you know, and we'll go through that. But the beauty of this is it's all about yourself. And, you know, we'll share everything after this on our platforms to our listeners and followers, and if you can do the same as well, because it'll help us build as a podcast.
Absolutely.
And it'll help you as well and get your words and what you want to get out there to our, you know, followers and what have you. So really, Simon Morris, welcome to Big Scuba. Over to you. Tell us about
Great.
you.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and to all of the divers in the UK and around the world. I was born in England in 1958, which is way too long ago, at Kingston-on-Thames. Came to Vancouver in British Columbia, Canada in 1966. And 29 years ago tomorrow moved to Salt Spring Island, which is a small island off the coast of Vancouver. We're about a 3.5-hour ferry ride from Vancouver. And this is where we've lived, raised our kids. It's where I keep my studio, and where I've built all of my sculpture. So I started welded steel sculpture as a kid when I was about 12, and did that for quite a few years. And in 1986, by sheer fluke, managed to get myself commissioned to create the first mermaid, which is known as the Emerald Princess, and she's in Powell River, British Columbia. It's about a 5-hour journey and 2 ferry rides north of Vancouver. So I was commissioned to do her in 1986, and we eventually sank her in March of 1989. So she's just had her 30th anniversary underwater up there. And that led me to do more and more bronze sculpture. Most of what I do is marine life and marine myth and fantasy, and an actual explorers and people well known in the maritime world. So I've been very fortunate and had some good public commissions. I have a piece of a guy named Henry Larson, who was the skipper of a Royal Canadian Mounted Police vessel called the St. Roch, which is at the Vancouver Maritime Museum. And he is a life-size bronze of Henry Larson, commemorating the fact that he and his ship were the first vessel to go through the Northwest Passage from west to east back in 1942.
Wow.
But mainly what I do is marine-related art, and I put the big pieces underwater. And I've been, for quite a few years now, trying to use, or not trying, actually succeeding to use the portion of proceeds of the sale of my art to promote environmental organizations and causes and that sort of thing. In fact, most of the art that I sell now, I sell through organizations like that. And it actually led to, in January of this year, it led me to being inducted as a signature member of the Artists for Conservation Foundation, which is a Canadian organization that, in their words, represents 500 of the world's most influential wildlife artists that work for conservation and that sort of thing. It's very difficult to get into, and I was quite honored and quite humbled to be accepted and invited. And they, every year, as I said, it started in Canada, but they operate in 30 countries now. And every year they have a major exhibition that starts at the Van Dusen Botanical Gardens in Vancouver, and then goes to Nevada, to China, other locations in Asia Pacific, and then over to Europe. So it travels for a year, and it's a juried selection process, and they accept just 50 applications from the 500 artists. And I was very fortunate to be selected this year. And this polar bear, actually, right here, if you can see it, I'm not sure.
Yes.
Yeah. He's a piece that right after this I'll be finished him, and will deliver him to my foundry. It's part of a much larger piece called Nowhere to Go, and it's commentary on the habitat loss and climate change in the Eastern Canadian Arctic. And in the section of ocean between basically the southwest of Greenland is becoming more and more open every year. The ice pack is melting considerably. And this is doing a couple of things. First of all, the polar bear are losing habitat. So this polar bear sits on top of a relatively small section of ice flow. And underneath it is a 36-inch high piece of an eroding iceberg. And to symbolize the fact that the narwhal are getting predation from the orca, who can now get into the narwhal's territory because the ice is gone, they're suffering pretty badly at the hands of the orca. So there's a 36-inch long orca chasing a narwhal around the iceberg, and the piece is called Nowhere to Go, and I have to have it cast by August the 10th. So the polar bear here is the last piece to get to the foundry.
Wow.
Everything else has been delivered in the last week, and I'll send you guys some photos when it's all done in August.
Oh, please, yeah.
What is the polar bear made of?
Mostly what I work in for detailed work is called microcrystalline wax. And as you can see, he's dark brown.
Yeah.
And these manatees here started out of the same material. Can you see the octopus down here?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. This octopus, if you can see, he's sort of guarding a rock that he's on. And octopus are hard to sculpt because basically they're bags of water. And how do you choose, you know, context and everything like that? So I actually went beach combing and found the rock that he's on the beach, brought the rock back to my studio, and then I used what's called plastilina clay and sculpted the octopus around the actual rock. And plastilina clay is a fine grade of terracotta clay that's been fired and then ground in a ball mill into powder, and then remixed with very high grade oil and wax. So it never, like ordinary water clay, it never dries, shrinks, or hardens, and remains plastic for as long as you need it. And basically, if you ever played with plasticine when you were a little kid, it's plasticine for grown-ups.
Right.
Wow. Amazing. Yeah.
And from this, we do the lost wax casting process to turn it into bronze. And so I guess I'm probably best known internationally for the large pieces that I do put underwater. I have a 9-foot tall Mermaid. The first one was in Powell River in 1989. And then in 2000, I put another casting of the same 9-foot Mermaid underwater at Sunset House in Grand Cayman. And then in 2014, I completed my largest sculpture to date, the Guardian of the Reef. And he is half man, half seahorse, atop a Roman column. I think you've seen him. He's on my,
Amazing,
website. And he and Amphitrite in Grand Cayman are very, very well known. Amphitrite was the second casting of just 2, so there won't be any more of that mermaid. But the Guardian of the Reef is the first casting of a worldwide limited edition of 4. And so I have been working hard over the last few months to develop relationships with other destinations. And very fortunately, I've run into people in some of the diving spots in the south of England that are very, very interested. So I'm currently in negotiations and discovering how to go through the permit process in England, because the permitting, the raising funds to do these are not that difficult, but the permit process can take years. And I have another sculpture, and it's called a hippocampus. And most people know that a hippocampus is the small gland at the base of your brain, but not everybody knows that it's called a hippocampus because it looks like one. And a hippocampus is, in Greek mythology, a horse mermaid. So if you imagine the front end of a rearing horse with a mermaid's tail, and then a young mermaid swimming alongside it. He has a long mane that she's sort of hanging onto. And April marked the 17th year of permit application. So it can take a long time. So I'm in discussions and negotiations right now to find out where the best place would be to put it and where we'll accept him. But basically, I guess because of my English heritage and background, I really want the second Guardian of the Reef sculpture to be on the south coast of England.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. How long does it take for you to make these casts?
Well, it obviously it depends on the size and the complexity of the piece. A life-size figure, the kind that you've seen on my website, usually takes me about 5 weeks of 10-hour days to make the original. And then it's usually about 3 months at the foundry. I'm not there the whole time, but elapsed time is 3 months. I completed most of the original work for the Guardian of the Reef in 2004 in about 2 months. And then the original organization that commissioned me to do it ran out of money and the ability to fundraise. Excuse me. And so he literally sat in my studio for 10 years. And it was a fluke meeting on LinkedIn that connected me with the people at Dive Tech on Grand Cayman, who became the client. And it was just, as I said, a fluke meeting on LinkedIn, and they didn't know anything about it. And they knew that I was the sculptor of the Mermaid, but they didn't know that I had started this other piece 10 years earlier. And from that chance meeting, within 4 weeks, we had the contract signed, and he was on his way to the foundry.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, amazing. So are you actually a diver as well? Do you like?
Oh, yes. my parents taught me to dive by throwing me in a swimming pool when I was, or not dive, to swim, by throwing me in a swimming pool when I was about 6 months old. And by the time I was 4, I was pestering them for what in those days was known as goggles and flippers in any of the sporting goods stores in London. And they did eventually find them. And so by the time I was about 5, I was snorkeling around at Brighton and Hayling Island and places like that, freezing myself half to death when I was a little kid. And then in 1966, we moved to British Columbia, which has fantastic diving. And I learned to dive when I was 15 in 1973. So I've now been diving 47 years. Wow. And I guess I've done about 2,000 dives. And I've been very fortunate. I've worked in the scuba diving industry most of my life. And do you guys know that the brand Bear in England?
B-A-R-E?
B-A-R-E. They make wetsuits, dry suits, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think I've seen their name.
They're in 53 countries, and they're pretty well known. I was vice president of product development for Bear for many years, and I was also general manager of Scuba Pro in Canada, and I was international product development manager for Scuba Pro for quite a few years, late 90s through 2000s.
Yeah.
All right, so you worked in the industry for quite a while then, really?
Oh yeah, almost all my life. I started diving in 73, and I started working in a dive shop in 74, and basically working ever since.
Yeah, so do you dive much now?
I dive as much as I can right now. COVID has put a little bit of an impact into that, and I've had a few setbacks over the years as far as my diving is concerned. I got badly bent in 2000, and I was out of the water for 5 years. Wow. Until I had enough treatment that I could get back in. And so after that, so I was out of the water from 2000 until 2005. And then I got a lot more hyperbaric O2 treatment and did get back in the water. I dive very conservatively these days. I haven't been beyond 80 feet since I got bent, because I really don't want to get bent again. No. And 2 years ago in January, I had a quadruple bypass, and that kept me out of the water for 6 months. But other than that, I'm as active as time permits, and I still love it as much as the day I started.
Good.
Yeah, that's really good.
And you can still see quite a lot from snorkeling as well, can't you? You know, these days.
Well, you can, and our waters are beautiful and our visibility is good. So snorkeling is great. Lots of life in the shallows here.
Yeah, I bet. Because you're on the far west coast, aren't you, over there?
Yes, we are. That if you look at the map of Western Canada and find Vancouver, just offshore from Vancouver, you'll see a big island called Vancouver Island. And it's at the bottom tip, or the southern tip, of Vancouver Island, where the city of Victoria lies. Yeah. And Victoria is actually the capital of British Columbia. And between the body of water between Vancouver and Vancouver Island is called the Georgia Strait. And in that strait are a group of islands, an archipelago of islands called the Gulf Islands. And I live on Salt Spring, which is the largest. I think it's about 20 kilometers long, and we have 13,000 people. And as of tomorrow, I will have lived here with my wife Melanie and our kids when they were still at home for 29 years. So wow. It's basically paradise. The diving is good. It's an artist community, tourism, farming, agriculture, wineries.
So what time is it over there?
The mildest climate in Canada.
What time is it over there at the moment?
It's 10:30. We're 8 hours behind.
Yeah. So these sculptures that get immersed in the sea, do they eventually turn into some kind of reef, or are they they don't attract any life?
Oh, they do attract life. The ones that get more heavily dived have less life on them. The one in Powell River probably receives the most diving traffic, and the life comes and goes. There was a period where she didn't get dived a lot. The local dive store went out of business, and she didn't get a lot of dive traffic for a couple of years. And within a very short period, she was absolutely covered in huge white plumose anemones, the same type of anemones that you have there in England. And if you didn't know she was there, you would not have recognized her. She was just covered. But as soon as the divers started coming back, I don't know if you know, but anemones get up and move if they get bothered. So they all left, and both the Mermaid and the Guardian have less life on them because they get a lot more diving traffic. But they're both starting to grow corals on them, and they have anemones. And to preserve the bronze, we use a cathodic zinc, exactly the same way you put a zinc on a bronze boat propeller. And you know, all of the studies and anecdotal evidence show that it does absolutely no environmental damage whatsoever. It's pretty much inert to the surrounding side. But the Guardian of the Reef, most of the photos of the Guardian are hard to see this feature, but the Roman column has big chunks torn out of it. And the way he is mounted is on a concrete pyramid that's it's 3 levels. Each level is about 16 inches high. The first level is 8 feet square, the second is 5 feet square, the third is 3 feet square, and in the middle of that, there is a concrete column that is slightly shorter and slightly narrower than the bronze column that he sits on. And so the idea is that it's cast in what's called critter-friendly pH concrete, so that it will actually attract encrusting marine life, so that the local indigenous marine life, wherever we put them, will grow on the concrete out through the big holes in the bronze column, and actually start to integrate him into the reef. And but are you guys familiar with an organization called Reef Ball?
Reef World, yes.
Yeah. Well, Todd Barber, the founder of Reef Ball in Florida, is an old friend of mine, and he's been very supportive of my underwater work and everything like that. And he has offered that any organization that puts in a Guardian of the Reef can purchase the Reef Ball program at their best pricing level, which is what they call educational and institutional. And so one of my goals is to set up the Guardian of the Reef as at the center of a Reef Ball installation, and add rings around him every year, so that students and marine biologists and everyday divers can actually track the growth over the years in an area where there perhaps wasn't anything before, but we'll create an underwater garden. So that's my hopes for the south of England.
Yeah, that's amazing. So what's the oldest sculpture you've got in the ocean?
Oh, that will be the first one, which is the Emerald Princess in Powell River, and she was sunk on March the 16th, 1989.
Right. Okay.
The second Mermaid, which is at Sunset House in Grand Cayman, will enjoy her 20th anniversary in November. And the Guardian of the Reef at Dive Tech went in April of 2014.
Do you say Dive Tech?
Dive Tech, yes.
Oh, okay.
Is it quite a logistic issue getting these sculptures, these statues into the water? How long does that take, and what does it involve?
It's not a huge operation. It is a little risky. and I tend to I tend to get pretty stressed out in the middle of it because generally it involves making the transition from where it is stored and displayed on land, from land to a boat, and then from the land base to where it's going to be sunk, and then lowered from the surface to where it's going to be installed. At Sunset House, this was relatively easy because the Mermaid Amphitrite was just put on their house reef, which is about 100 yards away from their water access point. So for that, we were able to just stand her up with a really big forklift with a hydraulic extender arm. And he picked her up and then slung her vertically and then took her out to, with this big extender arm, to where one of their dive boats that had a davit on board, they were able to transfer just by hooking to the rigging that they had set up. The forklift backed away and she was hanging in the water. They only had to transport her 100 yards and then lower her down with the davit to the waiting base. It was a little tricky because it was wavy and she was swinging through an arc, but we got her in there. The guardian of the reef at Dive Tech was more complicated because there isn't an access point. So he was on display at the Dive Tech resort for a few months, and then he had to be trucked to Georgetown, which is 7 miles away, and then transferred to a large system of lift bags horizontally. So he was hanging in the water horizontally, suspended under the lift bags, and then was towed in the ocean 7 miles
Like that?
all the way down to Dive Tech, and then lowered using they unhooked him from one of the lift bags so that he was hanging vertically. We had him rigged around the head and neck, and then very, very delicately controlling the buoyancy, got him down to the bottom, and then 4 or 5 divers with BPVs sort of jockeyed him into position. He was relatively easy
this process up.
to put him on.
Who plans all this process of how to do that? Because that's quite a task. That's quite a project to do that. Because
yeah,
there's much weight effect.
I provide the parameters of what the sculpture can bear as far as stress load and that kind of thing. And by the time when delivery to the customer is based on the day it's shipped from the foundry. So it's insured until it arrives at the destination. And after that, it's the responsibility of the installing customer to make sure that everything goes smoothly. But it's such a good publicity event, because let's face it, this is a relatively rare thing and most few people find it pretty interesting. We've always found that really good quality local infrastructure companies are willing to lend a hand, and so far, touch wood, we've never had an incident.
Then how do you fix them to the actual seabed?
Well, the Mermaid was put on a concrete base in Cayman with 3 holes about that big in diameter, probably 4 or 5 inches in diameter, extending down into the concrete base in a triangle. And coming out of the base of her tail are 3 fairly big, like 3-inch diameter rods that were designed to fit into those holes. And just as we just before we dropped her into position, we half filled the holes with speed creep that sets underwater, and then lowered her into it. And then she's rock solid. She in Cayman, she sits in 55 feet of water. And during Hurricane Ivan, the waves were so big that 3 times during the storm, her head was visible in the trough. And
Wow.
oh yeah, it was massive.
Wow.
I have another sculpture in Grand Cayman that's called Tradition, and he was right on the waterfront at the ruins of Fort George, probably 10 feet above sea level. And when Hurricane Ivan hit, that part of Cayman was underwater for 3 days, and they didn't know if he was there or not. And he survived. He went green from all of the salt, but he survived the hurricane very well. And the Guardian of the Reef, as I said, the base of that has a pillar it's quite big. It's just under 30 inches in diameter, and probably 3 feet tall. And the Guardian just slides on top of that like a sleeve. And then at the 4 corners of the bottom of the Roman column, there were 18-inch by 2-inch stainless steel ready rods that were dropped into 4 holes in a similar manner, half full of
I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
If there was somebody, you don't have to answer this, but if you wanted to sculpture somebody, make him out of brass and sink him in the ocean, do you have anyone in mind? Is there like a celebrity or just someone who you'd love to, who you haven't had a chance to sculpt yet?
I've done a couple of well-known people. You guys, I'm sure, are trained under BSAC, the British Sub-Aqua Club.
Well, Paddy, but we're quite famous.
So the Paddy is globally is the largest dive training organization, and their founders were Ralph Erickson and John Cronin. And John died, must be 15 years ago now. And Paddy commissioned me to do a life-size bust of John that sits in Founders Hall in Santa Ana. And then they decided that, well, we can't have John without Ralph, and Ralph was still alive. So they commissioned me to do one of Ralph's. So both of those busts are there. And Henry Larson is as I said, he was the skipper of the RCMP vessel St. Roch that went through the Northwest Passage. I actually came extremely close. This wouldn't have been underwater, but you guys must remember the show 40 Towers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of it takes place in the Exeter area, and Exeter has done very well with tourism. And at least 10 years ago, there was a move afoot to put a sculpture of John Cleese in the town somewhere in Exeter.
Really?
And through a long series of events, I won't even go into it because we've only got the 40 minutes. I ended up being selected as an artist to do a proposal to do a life-size figure of John Cleese as Basil Fawlty at a place in town. And one of my favorite scenes of him was the one with the plumber when it ends with him stalking off with a garden gnome under his arm. And so that's how I was going to do it. But of course, we had to get John Cleese's permission. And I ended up actually in email contact with John, and he was very nice about the whole thing and quite a hysterical guy. Yeah. And my champion was a MP in Exeter when you guys had a big. What the heck is that?
That's right. That's big.
Okay. You guys had a big by-election. And the Conservatives swept it that year, except for my guy in Exeter, and he was ousted, and his replacement had no interest in doing it. So
you could do one with Basil Fawlty as he hit the car with a brush.
That was one of my other when he gave the Mini a damn good thrashing.
Yeah,
that would have been another one. And at the same time, I had a group of people that wanted me to do Churchill. It looked for a moment that I would have both Churchill and Basil Fawlty in my studio at the same time.
Amazing.
And unfortunately, both of them fell through from funding issues and that kind of thing. So neither of them came off. But my next, as I said, my next piece that for underwater, like a new piece, I hope will be this Hippocampus. And I have another piece as far as putting people underwater. The Canadian Merchant Navy was very well known and very respected, and there's a great deal of gratitude towards the Canadian Merchant Navy from the British. And we've been sinking World War II and Cold War destroyers here in British Columbia. And in fact, our people here from the Artificial Reef Society were quite helpful with the organization in Plymouth that sank the Scylla. So I was part of a proposal to do a life-size bronze of a Canadian Merchant Navy member to go on a vessel here called the Cape Breton, which was a Canadian Merchant Navy vessel involved in the North Atlantic convoys in World War II. And once again, that was a project I got started. I did the original maquette this high, and ultimately, unfortunately, ran into some political issues with some of the people in the Canadian Merchant Navy that said, you know what, there's enough of our dead guys on the seabed, we don't want any more. So out of respect for them, I withdrew the project.
Yeah.
That's fair enough. Simon, we're nearly at the end, and it's been really great hearing your stories and about the diving and what have you. So for our listeners and hopefully prospective new clients for you, where do people need to go to find out more about you and the things that you're doing and to keep up to date with them?
Yeah, just my my website, which you have the address.
Yes.
And anybody is very welcome to email me at simon@sculptorsimonmorris.com, and you have that also.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. And are you on Instagram, Facebook?
Yes, I'm on Instagram and Facebook. On Instagram, I'm at Sculptor Simon Morris.
Okay, brilliant. Excellent. Okay. And we'll share all that and get all that out there for you, okay? And if you can do the same for us as well, we'll let you know.
Will, and there are a couple of really good videos that are on Vimeo by Franz de Backer, a friend of mine on Cayman, of The Guardian and Amphitrite in Cayman.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that if you give him credit, if you pull it, I'll send you the links.
That
And
was
if
great.
you pull little bits of that and give Franz credit, I'm sure he'd be very happy.
We always do, yeah. Let's have anything like that, and we'll put it all on, and we credit back. So whoever done that, they'll get the credit for it. Absolutely no problem at all. You know, do come back to us when you've got more news. You know, use us to spread the word. And do keep in contact with us. You know, keep in touch.
And certainly, if I make any progress with the Guardian in the south of England, I'll be sure to let you guys know.
Oh, definitely,
Thank you
yes.
very much.
Yeah. It's been so interesting. Yeah, it's amazing what you do.
It's very nice of you to have me on, and I appreciate your interest.
Yeah,
Well,
no, we'll keep in touch,
come back.
definitely. Yeah.
Definitely come back. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thanks, Simon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
What does it all come down to? I've never